Upon seeing the elderly man being attacked on the bridge, the man didn't hesitate to intervene. The next day, when a limousine stopped in front of his apartment, he had no idea what was about to happen. Marcus woke up before dawn, as usual. He threw on his running shoes, slipped on his worn hoodie, and left the apartment quietly so as not to wake his mother or sister. The early morning was his only time for himself, and he needed this run more than ever. The bills on the table, his mother's worsening diabetes, the landlord's threats, all of it hung over his head. The air was cold and crisp, but it felt good against his skin, clearing his thoughts. The bridge was empty except for the muffled rush of traffic from the nearby expressway. As Marcus approached, he could see the river's dark surface below. His breaths were even and rhythmic, his feet striking the pavement in a familiar pattern. He was just settling into his pace when he noticed something unusual. There was an old man at the far end of the bridge, and he wasn't alone. 3 figures surrounded him. Marcus squinted, slowing down his pace. Something wasn't right. The men were moving aggressively, their voices sharp even from this distance. He caught the glint of something, a baseball bat. Marcus could feel his pulse quickening, and it wasn't from the running. "Hey, come on, man, give it up," one of the men, a young guy with a red hoodie, said, shoving the elderly man back. "Please, I don't have anything," the old man stammered, holding up shaky hands. Marcus's heart pounded against his ribs. A part of him screamed to stay back, to turn around. He remembered his mom's tired face, his sister's worried look whenever she glanced at the front door. This wasn't his problem. But there was something else. A pull, a memory he didn't want to visit, but couldn't ignore. His father lying on the ground after an attempted robbery gone wrong. Before Marcus knew it, he was running faster than before straight toward the group. "Hey!" he yelled, his voice cracking through the cold morning air. The 3 men turned. The one in the red hoodie holding a bat frowned, then exchanged a quick glance with his friends. "Who the hell is this?" one of them muttered, looking annoyed. "Let the old man go," Marcus said, coming to a stop just a few feet away. He put his hands up, trying to keep his voice calm, but his heart was slamming in his chest. He knew the odds. He was outnumbered, and they had weapons. "You got a death wish, man?" Red Hoodie said, taking a step forward, the bat swinging lazily in his grip. Marcus glanced at the old man, who was trembling, his back pressed against the railing. Marcus knew he couldn't back out now. He took another step forward. "Just let him go," Marcus repeated. The guy in the red hoodie smirked and nodded to his friends. They fanned out, cutting off Marcus's escape. One of them, a lanky teen with a scar over his left eye, lunged forward. Marcus saw it coming, sidestepped, and shoved him away. But before he could react, Red Hoodie moved in, swinging the bat. It caught Marcus on the shoulder and pain shot through his arm, almost bringing him to his knees. "Ah, damn," Marcus hissed, stumbling back. He tried to stay on his feet, but his shoulder felt like it was on fire. The other 2 moved closer, emboldened by his stumble. "Get out of here, old man," Marcus shouted, his voice raw with urgency. The old man hesitated, his eyes wide with fear. "Go," Marcus repeated, and finally the old man turned, shuffling away as fast as his frail legs could carry him. The guy with the scar came at Marcus again, swinging wildly. Marcus ducked, throwing a punch that landed square in Scar's gut. The kid wheezed, doubling over. Marcus took a step back, trying to create some space, but Red Hoodie was right there, bat raised. "Think you're a hero, huh?" Red Hoodie said, grinning as he brought the bat down. Marcus barely managed to block it with his forearm, the impact sending shockwaves through his body. He was running out of steam fast, the pain making it hard to think. He needed help. He needed his phone. Marcus reached into his pocket, fumbling for it, but before he could dial, the third guy, who'd stayed quiet until now, stepped up and kicked it out of his hand. The phone skittered across the pavement, clattering to a stop far out of reach. "Not so smart now, huh?" the third guy sneered. He was bigger than the others, with thick shoulders and a menacing look in his eyes. Marcus's mind raced. He was cornered, out of options. The old man was gone. At least that was something. But now it was just him against three, and they weren't backing down. Red Hoodie raised the bat again, but then all three of them froze. There was a sound, a distant wail echoing through the morning air. Sirens. They were faint but growing louder. "Cops?" Scar wheezed, straightening up, looking around nervously. "Let's go, man," the third guy said, his eyes darting toward the road. Red Hoodie hesitated, glaring at Marcus, then spat on the ground. "You're lucky, man. Next time, you're dead." They turned and ran, disappearing down the side of the bridge, their footsteps echoing until they were gone. Marcus stood there, panting, every muscle in his body aching. His shoulder throbbed and he could barely move his arm. He stumbled over to where his phone had landed, picking it up with his good hand. The screen was cracked, but it still worked. He dialed 911, his fingers trembling. 911, what's your emergency?" A voice crackled on the other end. Marcus took a breath, trying to steady his voice. "There was an assault on the bridge. 3 guys. They ran off when they heard the sirens." "Are you hurt, sir?" Marcus looked down at his arm, already starting to bruise. "Yeah, but I'll be okay. Just send someone, please." He hung up, his breath coming in short bursts. The bridge was quiet again, the morning sun just starting to peek over the horizon. Marcus glanced down the bridge, seeing the old man in the distance, still moving away, unsteady but safe. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, the pain in his shoulder a dull reminder of what had just happened. He knew he'd made the right choice, but that didn't make it any easier. He turned, starting the slow walk back home, each step sending a jolt of pain through his body. He had no idea what was coming next, but he knew one thing for sure. Things weren't over. Not by a long shot. The door to Marcus's apartment opened with a soft creak. He stepped in, carefully closing it behind him to avoid waking anyone. His shoulder was throbbing, and he cradled it with his other hand, trying not to wince. He could hear his sister, Kayla, humming faintly from her room as she got ready for school. The muffled sound of a morning talk show came from the living room, where his mom must have dozed off again. He made his way down the narrow hallway, but before he could slip into his room, Kayla poked her head out. Her hair was still a mess, tangled curls springing every which way. "Marcus, you're back." She froze, her eyes widening as she took in his appearance. "What happened to you?" she asked, her voice suddenly high-pitched. Marcus sighed, shaking his head. "It's nothing, Kayla. I'm fine. Just got into a bit of trouble on my run." "A bit of trouble?" Kayla stepped out, her eyes locking on the deep bruise spreading over his shoulder. "What happened? Are you hurt bad?" Marcus gave her a forced smile. "I'm all right, okay? You know me, I don't break easily." He could see the doubt in her eyes, the fear she tried to hide, and he hated it. The last thing he wanted was for Kayla to worry. She already had too much on her plate. School, the stress of living in a neighborhood like theirs, the constant worry over their mom's health. It was Marcus's job to protect her from all of that. "Just go get ready for school, all right? I'll take care of this," Marcus said, giving her shoulder a gentle squeeze with his good hand. Kayla stared at him for a moment, then nodded reluctantly. "You better not lie to Mom about this," she warned, before turning and disappearing back into her room. Marcus sighed, rubbing his temple. He moved towards the bathroom, locking the door behind him. He pulled his hoodie off, wincing as the fabric brushed against his bruised skin. In the mirror, he could see the deep purple mark that stretched across his shoulder and upper arm. The sight made his stomach twist, but he tried to ignore it. There was no time to dwell on pain. He turned on the tap, letting cold water run over his hands before splashing it on his face. The sting of his cuts made him hiss, but it brought him some focus. He had to pull himself together. There was no other option. Suddenly there was a knock at the door. "Marcus, it's Sarah. Let me in." His girlfriend's voice was firm, and Marcus felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He opened the door just enough to let her slip in, her eyes already narrowed with worry. "Kayla called me. She said you're hurt." "What the hell happened?" she asked, her gaze dropping to his shoulder. Her eyes widened, and her jaw clenched. "Jesus, Marcus." "It's nothing," Marcus started, but Sarah shot him a look that could cut glass. "Nothing? That's a bruise the size of my head, Marcus. Don't you dare tell me it's nothing." She crossed her arms, her eyes not leaving his. "What did you do?" Marcus sighed, leaning against the sink. "There was an old man on the bridge, Sarah. He was getting attacked by some guys. I couldn't walk away." Sarah closed her eyes, letting out a frustrated breath. "You and your hero complex," she muttered, shaking her head. She opened her eyes and Marcus saw the anger mixed with fear. "You could have been killed, Marcus." "What were you thinking?" "I was thinking I couldn't let them hurt him," Marcus replied, his voice low. "They had bats, Sarah. They were gonna—" "You always do this," Sarah interrupted, her voice trembling. "You think you have to save everyone, but you don't think about what it means for us. For me, for Kayla, for your mom. What if you hadn't come back?" Marcus looked away, swallowing hard. He didn't have an answer for her. He had done what felt right. But now, seeing the fear in Sarah's eyes, he felt the weight of it all. She was right. He couldn't keep risking everything like this. "I know," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know it was stupid, but I couldn't just leave him." Sarah shook her head, her expression softening, though her eyes were still wet with unshed tears. She stepped closer, resting a hand on his uninjured arm. "I know why you did it, Marcus. I do. But you're not invincible. You can't keep putting yourself in these situations." She paused, biting her lip. "We need you here. I need you here, not in some hospital. Or worse." Marcus closed his eyes, nodding. He pulled her into a hug, careful not to use his bad shoulder. "I'm sorry," he whispered. They stayed like that for a long moment, Sarah's arms wrapped tightly around him, her cheek resting against his chest. Marcus wished he could promise her that he'd stop, that he'd never put himself in danger like that again. But he knew it wasn't that simple. It was who he was, someone who couldn't walk away when someone needed help. Finally, Sarah pulled away, wiping her eyes quickly before giving him a small smile. "Come on. Let's get some ice on that shoulder before your mom sees and has a heart attack." Marcus managed to smile. "Yeah, good idea." Sarah helped him back into the living room, where his mother was now awake, her eyes fixed on the television. She glanced up when she heard them, her brows furrowing. "Marcus, what's going on?" she asked, her voice wary. Her eyes fell on his bruised shoulder, and her face paled. "Oh, Marcus, what happened?" she asked, her voice trembling. Marcus forced a reassuring smile. "It's okay, Mom. Just got into a little scuffle. Nothing serious." His mom's eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head. "You shouldn't be getting into trouble like this, not with everything else going on." She looked to Sarah, who gave her a comforting nod. "We're taking care of it, Mrs. Johnson," Sarah said softly, guiding Marcus to sit down. "He's gonna be fine." Marcus's mom sighed, her hands trembling slightly as she reached out to touch his cheek. "You need to be careful, Marcus. We can't afford to lose you too." Marcus felt a lump in his throat. He nodded, taking her hand in his. "I know, Mom. I'll be careful, I promise." The rest of the morning passed in a blur. Sarah iced his shoulder, wrapping it in a makeshift bandage. Kayla rushed off to school after making Marcus promise, yet again, that he'd be careful. His mother, though still worried, eventually settled down, her gaze darting toward him every few minutes, as if to make sure he was still there. But it wasn't until later that day, after Sarah had gone home, that Marcus realized the full weight of what had happened. He was sitting on the couch, the TV playing softly in the background, when there was a knock at the door. Marcus frowned, getting up slowly. He opened the door to find a letter wedged in the frame. He pulled it out, his heart sinking as he saw the landlord's name on the front. He tore it open, his eyes scanning the lines quickly. It was an eviction notice. They had until the end of the week to pay the rent they owed, 3 months overdue, or they'd be out. Marcus let out a long breath, his shoulders sagging. He folded the letter, shoving it into his pocket. He glanced over at his mother, who had dozed off again on the couch. He couldn't let her see this. He couldn't let her worry more than she already was. As he stood there, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, wincing as the cracked screen lit up. It was a message from an unknown number. He opened it, his eyes widening as he read. "Nice move this morning, Marcus. We know where you live. You and your family better watch your backs." Marcus's blood ran cold. He stared at the message, his hands shaking slightly. The gang knew who he was. They knew where he lived. They weren't done with him yet. He swallowed hard, slipping the phone back into his pocket. The weight on his chest grew heavier, and he felt a chill run down his spine. He had put his family in danger by intervening on the bridge. He had done what felt right, but now the consequences were coming. Marcus clenched his jaw, his mind racing. He couldn't let this happen. He had to protect them. Somehow he had to figure this out. Marcus sat on the couch, the eviction notice crumpled in his hand. The muffled sounds of the television faded into the background. His mind was racing, the weight of everything crushing down on him. 3 months of rent overdue. A threat from a gang that knew where he lived. He had no idea how he was going to handle this. The front door creaked open and Kayla stepped inside, her school bag slung over her shoulder. She looked at Marcus and immediately noticed the tension in his face. "Marcus, what's going on?" she asked, her voice careful. She dropped her bag by the door and walked over, her eyes narrowing at the paper in his hand. He tried to hide it, but it was too late. Kayla reached out, snatching the eviction notice from him. She read it quickly, her eyes widening in shock. "They're kicking us out?" she whispered, her voice cracking. Marcus sighed, running a hand over his face. "If we don't pay by the end of the week, yeah," he said quietly. Kayla's face hardened. "How are we supposed to get that kind of money? We don't have anything saved." "I know," Marcus said, his voice tight. "But I'll figure it out. I need time." Kayla shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "This is because of those guys, isn't it? The ones from the bridge?" she asked. "They're going to come after us now, aren't they?" Marcus swallowed, his throat dry. He reached out, pulling Kayla into a hug. She stiffened for a moment before wrapping her arms around him. "I'm not going to let anything happen to you," Marcus whispered. "I promise." "But how?" Kayla pulled back, looking up at him, her eyes searching his face. "You can't fight them all, Marcus. You're just one person." "I don't know yet," he admitted. "But I'll find a way. I'll talk to the landlord, see if I can get more time. I'll pick up extra shifts, do whatever it takes. But I won't let them take our home." Kayla nodded, her lips pressed tightly together. "You have to be careful, okay? You can't keep getting into fights like this." "I know," Marcus said. He smiled, trying to ease the tension. "I promise no more hero stuff. Just regular, boring Marcus for a while." Kayla didn't look convinced, but she nodded. "Okay, but if you need anything..." "I'll let you know," Marcus said, giving her another hug. "Now go get started on your homework. I'll figure the rest out." Kayla hesitated, then nodded again, walking down the hall to her room. Marcus watched her go, his heart heavy. He had made promises, but he had no idea how he was going to keep them. A few hours later, as the sun began to set, Marcus found himself pacing the small kitchen, his thoughts running in circles. His mother was in her room, resting, unaware of the looming threat. He had to protect her, protect Kayla. But the weight of it all was crushing. His phone buzzed on the counter, breaking him out of his thoughts. He picked it up, wincing at the cracked screen. It was a message from Sarah. "Coming over. We need to talk." Marcus sighed, putting the phone down. He knew this conversation was coming, but he wasn't ready for it. He wasn't ready to admit that he didn't have all the answers. A few minutes later, there was a knock at the door. Marcus opened it, and there stood Sarah, her expression a mix of worry and anger. She stepped inside, her eyes scanning his face. "You look like hell," she said bluntly, closing the door behind her. "Thanks," Marcus said, managing a small smile. "You always know how to cheer me up." Sarah didn't smile. She crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing. "Kayla called me again. She's scared, Marcus, and I don't blame her. What are you going to do about this?" "I don't know," Marcus admitted, leaning against the wall. "I'm trying to figure it out. The landlord wants the rent. The gang knows where we live. It's all piling up, and I don't have a plan." Sarah's expression softened, and she stepped closer, reaching up to touch his cheek. "You don't have to do this alone, you know. Let me help." Marcus shook his head. "I can't drag you into this, Sarah. It's too dangerous. These guys, they're serious." "I'm not scared," Sarah said, her voice firm. "I care about you, Marcus, and I care about your family. We'll figure this out together, but you need to let me in." Marcus looked at her, his chest tightening. He wanted to protect her, to keep her safe from all of this, but he also knew he couldn't do it alone. He nodded slowly. "Okay," he said quietly, "but we have to be smart about this. No taking risks. I can't lose you." Sarah smiled, leaning in to press a kiss to his forehead. "You're not going to lose me. We're in this together." She took his hand, pulling him over to the small table in the kitchen. "Now let's make a plan. We have a week to come up with the rent, right?" "Yeah," Marcus said, sitting down across from her. "But it's not just the rent. The gang, they're not done. They sent me a message. They know where we live." Sarah's eyes widened slightly, but she nodded. "Then we'll deal with that too. One thing at a time. First, we need to talk to the landlord, see if we can get an extension." Marcus sighed. "I doubt he'll go for it. He's been threatening to kick us out for months now." "Maybe if we explain the situation," Sarah began, but Marcus shook his head. "No, he doesn't care about our situation. He just wants his money." Marcus leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. "But I'll talk to him. It's worth a shot." Sarah nodded. "And I'll see if I can get some extra shifts at the diner. It's not much, but it might help." Marcus looked at her, his heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you, Sarah. I don't know what I'd do without you." "You'd probably get yourself killed," she said with a small smirk. "But luckily you've got me to keep you in line." Marcus smiled, the tension in his chest easing slightly. They had a plan, however fragile it was, and for now, that was enough. The next morning, Marcus was up early again. His shoulder still ached, but he pushed the pain to the back of his mind. He had more important things to worry about. He left a note for his mom, letting her know he'd be back soon, and headed out the door. The landlord's office was a few blocks away, a small, dingy building with peeling paint. Marcus stood outside for a moment, taking a deep breath before pushing the door open. The landlord, Mr. Harris, was sitting behind a cluttered desk, his eyes narrowing as he saw Marcus. "Johnson," Harris said, his voice flat. "You here to pay up?" Marcus swallowed, stepping forward. "I wanted to talk to you about the rent. I just need a little more time. A week, maybe 2, and I'll have the money." Harris leaned back in his chair, his lips curling into a sneer. You're already 3 months behind, Johnson. Why should I believe you now? Because I'm working on it, Marcus said, his voice steady. I've got a plan. I just need a little more time. Harris shook his head. I've heard that before. You've got until the end of the week. After that, you're out. Marcus clenched his jaw, trying to keep his frustration in check. Please, Mr. Harris. My mom's sick. My sister's still in school. I just need a little more time. Harris stared at him for a long moment, then sighed, rubbing his temples. All right, Johnson. 1 more week, but that's it. No more excuses. Marcus nodded, relief washing over him. Thank you. I promise I won't let you down. Harris waved him off and Marcus turned, heading back out into the morning air. It wasn't much, but it was something. He had a week to come up with the money, and he wasn't going to waste a second. As he walked back toward the apartment, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, his stomach clenching as he saw another message from the unknown number. Time's running out, hero. You think you're safe, but we're watching. Marcus stopped in his tracks, his heart pounding. He looked around, his eyes scanning the street. He couldn't see anyone, but he knew they were there, watching, waiting. He took a deep breath, slipping his phone back into his pocket. He wasn't going to let fear control him. Not now. Not ever. He had too much to protect. Marcus continued walking, his steps quick and determined. He had 1 week. 1 week to save his family, to keep them safe, and he wasn't going to fail them. The sunrise broke over the skyline, casting a golden glow over the cramped streets of Marcus's neighborhood. He trudged up the stairs to his apartment, still feeling the weight of Mr. Harris's warning in his ears. 1 more week. That was all the time he had to change everything. He opened the door, stepping inside quietly. His mother was still resting and Kayla was already gone, her school books missing from the table. Marcus sighed, relieved that at least she was going about her day as normally as possible. He heard the soft knock just before he closed the door behind him. The sound wasn't frantic, but it carried a sense of urgency. Marcus's stomach twisted as he turned back, opening the door. Sarah? He asked, his voice showing his surprise. Sarah stood in the hallway, her expression clouded. We need to talk, she said, stepping inside before Marcus could even move out of her way. What's wrong? Marcus asked, closing the door behind her. Sarah hesitated for a moment, her eyes darting toward the closed door of his mother's room, then back to Marcus. It's Kayla, she said finally. Something happened. Marcus felt his heart drop. What do you mean? She got followed today, Sarah said, her voice shaking slightly. After she left for school, one of the guys from the bridge, she called me. Said she thought she saw him in a car when she was waiting for the bus. Then again when she was walking down her street. Marcus stared at her, a cold dread settling in his stomach. Are you sure? Sarah nodded, her face serious. She recognized him, Marcus. The scar, the face, it's definitely him. Marcus clenched his jaw, his hands balling into fists at his sides. His worst fear was coming true. They weren't backing down. They knew exactly who to target. She didn't want to come home, Sarah continued. She was scared they'd see her, know where she lives. She's at my place right now. Marcus nodded, his thoughts racing. All right, I need to go see her. Make sure she's okay. Of course, Sarah said. But Marcus, what are we going to do? This can't keep happening. Marcus let out a long breath, rubbing his face. I don't know. I have to protect her, protect my mom. But I can't fight these guys alone. Sarah reached out, taking his hand. We'll figure it out. But you need to be careful, Marcus. If they know where we live, we need to start thinking about what happens if they come after us again. Marcus nodded slowly. I know. But right now I need to make sure Kayla's safe. Sarah squeezed his hand, her eyes softening. Let's go. She needs you. They walked quickly to Sarah's apartment, which was only a few blocks away. Marcus's shoulder still ached, but he ignored it, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other. They reached the building, Sarah leading him up the stairs. She unlocked the door and they stepped inside. Kayla was sitting on the couch, her legs pulled up to her chest. She looked up when she saw Marcus, her eyes wide with fear. "Marcus," she whispered. Marcus crossed the room in a few strides, pulling her into a hug. She clung to him, her body trembling. "I was so scared," she said, her voice muffled against his chest. "I didn't know if he was going to come after me. I tried to lose him, but—" "Shh, it's okay," Marcus said, holding her close. "You did the right thing coming here. I'm not going to let anything happen to you." Kayla pulled back, her eyes wet with tears. "How are you going to stop them? There's so many of them, Marcus. And it's not just me, they know where we all live." Marcus swallowed hard, his chest tightening. "I know, but I'm not going to let them scare us. We just have to be careful. Stick together." Kayla nodded, wiping her eyes. I just want things to be normal again." "I know, Kay," Marcus said softly. "Me too. And I promise I'm going to do everything I can to make that happen." Sarah stepped forward, her hand resting on Kayla's shoulder. "You can stay here tonight if you want," she said. "It might be safer." Kayla looked at Marcus, her eyes questioning. Marcus hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, that's a good idea. You stay here with Sarah. I'll go back and check on Mom. I'll be back later, okay?" Kayla nodded, her eyes still wide. "Okay, but be careful, Marcus." "I will," he promised, giving her a small smile. He turned to Sarah, his expression serious. "Keep her safe. I'll call if anything happens." Sarah nodded, her eyes meeting his. "I will, just don't do anything stupid, okay?" Marcus managed a half smile. "No promises," he said, though his voice lacked any humor. Marcus left Sarah's apartment, the door clicking softly behind him. The weight on his shoulders seemed to grow with every step he took back toward his building. He knew they couldn't keep living like this, always looking over their shoulders, always waiting for the next threat. But what choice did he have? As he reached his block, Marcus noticed a car parked across the street, the engine still running. He slowed his pace, squinting at the darkened windows. The car looked familiar. Too familiar. His heart began to race, adrenaline flooding his veins. Suddenly, the driver's window rolled down, and Marcus's breath caught in his throat. It was Scar, the guy from the bridge. His face twisted in a grin as he looked straight at Marcus. "Hey, hero," Scar called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "Enjoying the neighborhood?" Marcus's fists clenched at his sides. He took a step forward, his jaw tight. "You need to get out of here now." Scar laughed, leaning back in his seat. "Or what? You gonna call the cops?" He shook his head, still grinning. "We just wanted to say hi. Make sure you remember what's at stake here." Marcus's blood boiled, every muscle in his body screaming for him to do something. But he knew better. He couldn't take on Scar, not now, not here. He had to be smart. He had to think of Kayla, of his mom. Scar seemed to sense Marcus's hesitation, and his grin widened. "That's what I thought. You're not as tough as you think, are you?" He started the car, the engine roaring to life. "See you around, hero." With that, Scar drove off, the tires squealing as he sped away. Marcus stood there, his heart pounding, his hands still balled into fists. He watched until the car disappeared down the street, then let out a long, shaky breath. He turned and headed back into his building, climbing the stairs 2 at a time. When he reached the apartment, he unlocked the door and stepped inside, closing it behind him. His mother was still resting, her breathing soft and steady from her room. Marcus walked over to the kitchen, leaning heavily against the counter. He needed a plan. Something had to change. He couldn't let these guys control his life, control his family. He had to do something, anything, to protect them. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he pulled it out, half expecting another message from the gang. But it wasn't. It was a number he didn't recognize. He frowned, answering it cautiously. "Hello? Mr. Johnson?" The voice was unfamiliar, but it was calm, collected. "This is George. I believe you saved my life the other morning." Marcus's eyes widened slightly. He remembered the old man on the bridge, the one he had defended. "George? How did you get my number?" George chuckled softly. "I have my ways, young man. I heard about your troubles, and I think I can help you." Marcus hesitated, his brow furrowing. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do," George said, his tone serious. "Meet me tomorrow morning, at the park by the bridge. We'll talk more then." Before Marcus could respond, the line went dead. He stared at his phone, his mind racing. Who was George, really? And how did he know about the threats, about the gang? Marcus let out a shaky breath, putting his phone down on the counter. He didn't know what was going on, but he had no other options. He needed help, and if George was offering, he had to take it. He couldn't do this alone. Not anymore. He looked over at his mother's door, the sound of her steady breathing calming him slightly. He wasn't going to let them take everything from him. Not now. Not ever. Tomorrow, he would meet George. And maybe, just maybe, he'd finally find a way to fight back. The next morning, Marcus stood outside the park near the bridge. The cold air bit into his skin, but he didn't move. He was early. The place was quiet, with only a few people jogging past, and the bridge loomed in the distance, silent, almost like a witness to everything that had happened. He stared at the river below, trying to steady his thoughts. He wasn't sure what he was expecting. A part of him wondered if this George would even show up. And if he did, what could this old man really offer? He had a weird feeling in his gut, half hope, half doubt. The low rumble of an approaching vehicle pulled Marcus out of his thoughts. He turned, squinting at the bright headlights that came down the parkway. The car moved slowly, rolling to a stop a few feet from where Marcus stood. He blinked, taken aback. It was a limousine. The window rolled down and Marcus recognized George's face immediately. The old man leaned forward, a soft smile on his lips. "Good morning, Marcus," George said, his voice warm, almost too casual for the scene. Marcus approached cautiously, still processing the sight of the fancy car. Morning," he replied. "You said you could help me?" George nodded, pushing the door open from the inside. "Come in, Marcus. We'll talk." Marcus hesitated for a split second, then took a breath and climbed in. The leather seats were soft beneath him, and he felt out of place, his worn hoodie and sneakers contrasting with the luxury around him. The driver barely acknowledged him, his eyes fixed straight ahead. George closed the door, the limousine pulling away smoothly. Marcus looked at the older man, who seemed much more at ease than he had been that day on the bridge. His clothes were well-tailored, his demeanor calm. "You've been through quite a bit since we last met, haven't you?" George said, watching Marcus carefully. Marcus frowned, leaning back. "How do you know about that?" George waved a hand dismissively. "I've lived in this neighborhood for a long time, Marcus. I hear things. People talk. Besides..." He looked at Marcus, his eyes kind but serious. "I owe you my life. The least I could do is make sure you're safe." Marcus shook his head, not quite understanding. "Look, I'm not sure what you think you can do. These guys, they're serious. They've been following my sister, threatening my family. I don't even know how you can help." George leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Marcus, I'm not just some helpless old man. I've spent my entire life building businesses, making connections. I've got resources, people who owe me favors." He paused, watching Marcus closely. "What you did for me, stepping in like that, It was brave, and I know you didn't do it for any kind of reward, but you've put yourself in danger, and I'm not about to let you or your family suffer because of it." Marcus stared at him, his mind reeling. It was almost too much to believe that this stranger had connections, money, and that he was willing to use it to help. It didn't make sense. "Why?" Marcus asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Why do this for me?" George smiled, a sad sort of smile. "Because once upon a time I was where you are now, young, trying to protect the people I loved, with no one to help me." He sighed, shaking his head. "No one should have to do it alone. And you're a good man, Marcus. You deserve better." Marcus felt his throat tighten. He looked down at his hands, unsure of what to say. He'd spent so long feeling like he was fighting an uphill battle, like there was no one he could count on except himself. And now, here was this man, offering him a lifeline. "What exactly are you offering?" Marcus finally asked, his voice hesitant. George nodded, as if he had been expecting the question. "I'm offering you a way out of this mess. I've already spoken to your landlord. The rent is taken care of for now. That should ease some of the pressure." Marcus's eyes widened. Wait, what? You paid my rent?" George nodded. "Yes. And as for the men who have been threatening you..." He paused, his expression hardening. "I've made some calls. They won't be bothering you or your family anymore." Marcus stared at George, his mind spinning. He didn't know whether to feel relieved or worried. "How do you know they'll stay away?" George smiled faintly. "Let's just say they've been given a reason to reconsider their actions. I have friends who deal with situations like this, people who understand how to send a message." Marcus let out a long breath, a mixture of relief and disbelief washing over him. For the first time in what felt like forever, the weight on his chest seemed to ease, even if just a little. "I don't know what to say," he murmured. "Thank you." George shook his head. "No thanks needed, Marcus. You did something that most people wouldn't have. And now it's my turn to help you." The limousine slowed to a stop, and Marcus realized they were back near his apartment. George reached into his pocket, pulling out a small envelope. He handed it to Marcus. "What's this?" Marcus asked, taking it carefully. "Consider it a start," George said. "There's enough there to cover some of your immediate expenses. But it's not charity, Marcus. It's an investment. I believe in you. You have potential, and I want to see you succeed." Marcus opened the envelope, his eyes widening slightly at the sight of the cash inside. He swallowed, looking back at George. I don't know what to say. I've never had anyone do something like this for me." George smiled. "Just promise me one thing, Marcus. Don't waste this chance. Use it to build something better, for yourself, for your family." Marcus nodded, his throat tight. "I will, I promise." George patted his shoulder gently, his eyes warm. "Good. Now go on. Take care of your family. And if you need anything, you have my number." Marcus nodded again, opening the door and stepping out of the limousine. He stood there for a moment, watching as it drove away, the weight of everything hitting him all at once. He had help now. He wasn't alone. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, things could get better. Back at his apartment, Marcus opened the door quietly. His mother was in the living room, a worried expression crossing her face as soon as she saw him. "Where have you been, Marcus?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. "I had to meet someone," Marcus said, closing the door behind him. He walked over, sitting down beside her on the couch. He took her hand in his, looking into her eyes. "Mom, things are going to get better, I promise." His mother frowned, her eyes searching his face. "What do you mean?" Marcus hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath. "We're not getting kicked out. The rent's been taken care of, and I've got a plan. I'm going to make things right for us." His mother's eyes filled with tears, her lips trembling. "Oh, Marcus," she whispered, her voice breaking. How did you manage this?" Marcus squeezed her hand gently. "I got help from someone who owes me a favor, and I'm going to use it to take care of you and Kayla." She reached up, her hand resting on his cheek, her eyes filled with both relief and worry. "You're a good boy, Marcus. Just please be careful." "I will, Mom," Marcus said, his voice thick. "I promise." That night, for the first time in what felt like forever, Marcus allowed himself to breathe. The threats, the rent, the constant fear. It wasn't all over, but it was manageable. He had a way forward, a chance to make things right, and he was going to take it. The morning sun filtered through the thin curtains of Marcus's small room, waking him up earlier than usual. He blinked, momentarily disoriented, until the events of the previous day rushed back to him. George's help, the cash in the envelope, the promise he made to his mother, it all came flooding back. Marcus took a deep breath and sat up, the ache in his shoulder a reminder of how far he'd come. He knew today wasn't going to be easy, but he felt ready for it. He had a decision to make. He couldn't keep up with both of his jobs and take care of his family the way they needed him to. It was time to make a choice, and he had to do it for the sake of his mom and Kayla. His mother was already up by the time he walked into the kitchen. She was humming softly to herself, stirring something on the stove. The smell of coffee filled the air, and Marcus's heart tightened with a mix of gratitude and worry. He couldn't let her keep struggling like this. He had to be here for her. "Morning, Mom," Marcus said, his voice still a bit rough from sleep. His mother turned, giving him a small smile. "Good morning, sweetheart. I made some coffee. You need to start the day right, you know?" Marcus smiled, taking a seat at the small, cluttered kitchen table. "Thanks, Mom. Listen, there's something I need to talk to you about." She looked at him, concern flickering in her eyes. "What is it?" Marcus took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "I'm thinking of quitting one of my jobs, the delivery one. It's too much and I can't keep up with it all. I want to be here more, for you and Kayla." His mother frowned, setting the wooden spoon down on the counter. "But Marcus, we need the money. I don't want you to feel like you have to give up everything for us." "It's not giving up, Mom," Marcus said gently. "It's making a choice. I can't keep pushing myself like this. I've been working 2 jobs and it's wearing me down. I want to be here more. I want to take care of you, and I can't do that if I'm always out working." She hesitated, her eyes glistening slightly. I don't want you to struggle." Marcus reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "I know, Mom, and we're going to be okay. I've got help now. We're not alone, but I need to do this for all of us." She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly, a tear slipping down her cheek. "All right, Marcus. I trust you." After breakfast, Marcus left the apartment and walked the few blocks to the office of the delivery company. It was a small, nondescript building with a faded sign hanging over the entrance. Marcus pushed open the door, the bell above it jangling as he stepped inside. The receptionist looked up, her eyes widening slightly in recognition. "Hey, Marcus, what brings you in today?" "I need to speak to Mr. Sanchez," Marcus said, his voice steady. "I'm here to quit." The receptionist nodded, picking up the phone and speaking quietly into it. A moment later, she looked up at Marcus and smiled. "You can go on back." Marcus nodded, heading down the narrow hallway. He reached Mr. Sanchez's office and knocked lightly on the door. "Come in," a gruff voice called out. Marcus pushed the door open, stepping inside. Mr. Sanchez, a stout man with a receding hairline, looked up from his desk, his eyebrows lifting in surprise. "Marcus, didn't expect to see you here today. Everything all right?" Marcus took a deep breath, stepping forward. "I need to quit, Mr. Sanchez. I can't keep working here." Mr. Sanchez leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowing. Quit? You're one of my best delivery guys, Marcus. What's going on? It's just too much, Marcus said, trying to keep his voice steady. I've got a lot going on at home. My mom's not well, and I need to be there for her. I can't keep working 2 jobs. Mr. Sanchez nodded slowly, rubbing his chin. I get it, kid. Family comes first. I hate to lose you, but I understand. He paused, then gave Marcus a small smile. You take care of your family, and if you ever need this job back, you just come see me, all right? Marcus felt a rush of relief, and he nodded. Thank you, Mr. Sanchez. I appreciate it. Mr. Sanchez stood, extending his hand. Marcus shook it, his grip firm. Take care of yourself, Marcus, and good luck. As Marcus stepped out of the building, he felt a strange sense of freedom. He had taken the first step. He was letting go of the constant rush, the endless shifts. He was making room to actually take care of the people he loved. He walked back toward home, his thoughts racing. He had to use the money from George wisely. It wasn't going to last forever. But if he could make the right moves, maybe it would be enough to give them a fresh start. He stopped by a small convenience store, picking up some groceries before heading back to the apartment. As he approached the door, he heard voices inside. Laughter, light and carefree. He opened the door to see Kayla sitting at the table with Sarah, both of them smiling, a deck of cards spread out between them. Look who's back, Sarah said, looking up and giving Marcus a grin. We've been teaching Kayla how to cheat at cards. Kayla rolled her eyes, smiling as she looked at her brother. It's not cheating if you're just good at it, she said, her voice full of mock indignation. Marcus chuckled, setting the grocery bag on the counter. You two behaving yourselves? Kayla gave him an innocent look, while Sarah just shrugged. Define behaving, she said, winking. Marcus shook his head, a real smile tugging at his lips. He walked over to Kayla, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. How are you doing, Kay? You feeling okay? She nodded, leaning into him. Yeah, I'm still kind of scared, but I trust you, Marcus. I know you'll take care of us. Marcus felt his chest tighten, and he hugged her a little closer. I will. I promise. He looked at Sarah, their eyes meeting across the table. She gave him a small nod, her smile softening. Marcus knew he wasn't alone. He had them, and they had him, and they would figure it out together. Later that afternoon, Marcus sat at the small kitchen table, staring at the cash from George. He had spread it out in neat piles, trying to make sense of it all. Rent, bills, groceries. He needed to make it stretch as far as possible. He had a plan, but it was going to take every bit of effort he had. Sarah sat across from him, her eyes flicking between the cash and Marcus's face. So, what's the plan? She asked quietly. Marcus sighed, running a hand over his hair. I'm going to use this to pay off the bills first. Then I want to start something small, maybe a delivery service just here in the neighborhood. Nothing big, but enough to make some money without working myself to death. Sarah nodded, her brow furrowing thoughtfully. That could work. People around here need reliable services, and you know everyone. They trust you. Yeah, Marcus said, nodding slowly. I think it could work. I just need to be smart about it. Take it one step at a time. Sarah reached across the table, resting her hand on his. You're doing the right thing, Marcus. For your family, for yourself. You're going to make this work. Marcus looked at her, his heart swelling with gratitude. He squeezed her hand gently. I hope so. I want things to be better. For all of us. They will be, Sarah said, her voice full of conviction. You're going to make sure of that. That night, Marcus sat on the couch, his mother beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. The TV played softly in the background, but neither of them was really watching. Kayla was in her room, and Sarah had gone home for the night. His mother looked at him, her eyes tired but full of love. "You've grown up so much, Marcus," she said softly. "Your father would be proud." Marcus felt his throat tighten and he nodded. "I just want to take care of you, Mom. That's all that matters to me." She smiled, her eyes misting over. "You already are, sweetheart. You've always been taking care of us." Marcus looked away, blinking back the tears that threatened to fall. He wasn't sure if he deserved her praise, but he knew he was going to do everything in his power to make sure she never had to worry again. As the night wore on, Marcus felt a sense of calm settle over him. The choices he had made that day, the sacrifices, it was all worth it. He was building something new, something better for his family. And he wasn't alone anymore. He had Sarah, Kayla, his mom, and he had George's help. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. And that was enough. The sun was just rising over the rooftops as Marcus opened the door to the old storage room behind their building. Dust motes floated in the light, and the place smelled faintly of mildew. It was hardly glamorous, but Marcus didn't need glamour. He needed a starting point, and this was it. He set down the supplies he had brought with him, a few cardboard boxes, a notepad, and some markers. The storage room wasn't big, but it was enough space to organize what he hoped would become his delivery hub. Just a small operation, something manageable. He was counting on the community to support him, but more than anything, he was counting on his determination to make this work. Sarah had convinced the landlord to let them use the space. She had a way of persuading people, and Marcus was grateful for her help. They both knew it wasn't much, but it was a start, and that was more than enough for Marcus. He heard footsteps behind him and turned to see Sarah walking in, a grin on her face. "This place is, well, it's got character," she said, raising an eyebrow. Marcus chuckled, shaking his head. "Yeah, it's not much, but it'll work. For now, anyway." Sarah looked around, her hands on her hips. "It's got potential. We just need to clean it up, make it look like something that people can trust." She gave him a sidelong glance. "You know, like maybe a place that isn't haunted." "Funny," Marcus said, his smile widening. "But you're right. We need it to look less like a storage closet and more like a real operation." They got to work, clearing away old boxes and dusting off the shelves that lined the walls. The morning passed quickly, with Sarah cracking jokes and Marcus doing his best to keep up. By noon, they had managed to clear enough space to set up a small counter, using an old table they had found in the back corner. Sarah wiped her forehead, her hair tied back in a messy bun. "You know, this isn't half bad," she said, surveying their work. Marcus nodded, stepping back to take it all in. It was still rough, but it looked like a place where he could build something real. "Yeah, it's getting there." Sarah turned to him, her eyes serious. "You think people will use it? I mean, we've got a lot of competition. Apps, other services." Marcus shrugged. "I think people will. Not everyone in the neighborhood trusts those bigger services. And if I can make it personal, if I can make them trust me, I think we'll be okay." Sarah nodded, her eyes softening. "You're right. People around here know you. They know you're one of them." Marcus smiled. "Yeah, that's the plan." By mid-afternoon, Marcus was ready to spread the word. He had printed a stack of flyers. Nothing fancy, just something that told people about the new delivery service. Marcus's Community Deliveries. Simple, clear, and something that people could get behind. Sarah stayed behind to finish setting things up, and Marcus walked through the neighborhood, tacking flyers onto telephone poles and slipping them under doorways. He talked to a few people he knew along the way, neighbors, shopkeepers, anyone who might need a hand with deliveries. He stopped in front of Mrs. Alvarez's small grocery store, peeking in through the window. She looked up from behind the counter, her face breaking into a smile when she saw him. She waved him in. "Marcus, it's been a while. How's your mother doing?" she asked, her voice warm. "She's doing okay, Mrs. Alvarez. Thanks for asking," Marcus said, stepping inside. Mrs. Alvarez looked at the flyer in his hand, her brow lifting. "What's this?" Marcus handed it to her, smiling. "I'm starting a delivery service. Local, just for the neighborhood. I thought maybe you could use some help getting groceries to people who can't make it out here." She read the flyer, her lips curving into a thoughtful smile. "That's a good idea, Marcus. There are a lot of people who could use this. You know Mrs. Jenkins down the street can't get around much anymore." Marcus nodded. "That's exactly who I'm thinking of. People like her. I just want to help out, make things easier." Mrs. Alvarez looked at him for a long moment, then nodded, slipping the flyer under her counter. "I'll tell people about it. You're a good boy, Marcus. This neighborhood needs someone like you." Marcus felt his chest swell with pride. "Thank you, Mrs. Alvarez. I really appreciate it." By the time Marcus got back to the storage room, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the pavement. He stepped inside, the smell of fresh paint hitting him. Sarah looked up, grinning. "Guess what? I found some leftover paint in the back. Figured we'd give this place a facelift," she said, holding up a paintbrush. Marcus laughed, shaking his head. "You really think of everything, don't you?" Sarah shrugged, her grin widening. "Hey, if we're going to do this, we're going to do it right. Plus, a little color goes a long way." Marcus grabbed another brush, dipping it in the paint. "All right, let's make this place look like a real business." They worked in silence for a while, the only sound the swish of the paintbrushes against the walls. The pale blue paint brightened the room, and with every stroke Marcus felt a little more hope. This was something he could be proud of, something that could really make a difference. After a while, Sarah spoke, her voice soft. "You know, Marcus, I think this is going to work. I really do." Marcus looked over at her, the brush pausing in his hand. "You think so?" She nodded, her eyes meeting his. "Yeah, you're doing something real here. People need that. They need someone they can trust." Marcus swallowed, his throat tight. I want to make things better. For my family. For everyone around here." Sarah set her brush down, walking over to him. She took his hand in hers, her fingers warm against his. "You already are, Marcus. This is just the beginning." He looked at her, his heart swelling. He knew she was right. This was the start of something new, something good. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, they could make it work. The next morning, Marcus woke up early, excitement buzzing under his skin. Today was the day he would start taking orders. He got dressed quickly, pulling on a clean shirt and jeans. He checked on his mom, who was still asleep, her breathing even and calm. He smiled, quietly closing the door behind him. He stepped out into the crisp morning air, making his way to the storage room, his office. He unlocked the door, stepping inside. The paint had dried, the shelves were neatly arranged, and the table in the center served as a counter. It wasn't perfect, but it was his, and it was ready. Sarah arrived a few minutes later, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Morning, boss," she said, grinning as she handed him a cup. Marcus took it, smiling. "Boss, huh? I like the sound of that." Sarah laughed, taking a sip of her coffee. "Well, you better get used to it. People are going to be coming in today. I posted a few more flyers yesterday evening." Marcus nodded, his heart pounding with a mix of nerves and excitement. "Let's hope they do." It didn't take long. By mid-morning, the door opened and Mrs. Jenkins stepped inside, her cane tapping against the floor. Marcus stood up, smiling warmly. "Mrs. Jenkins, it's good to see you," he said. She smiled back, her eyes crinkling. "Mrs. Alvarez told me about what you're doing, Marcus. I could use some help getting my groceries. My legs aren't what they used to be." Marcus nodded. "Absolutely, Mrs. Jenkins. Just let me know what you need and I'll take care of it. She handed him a small list, her hands trembling slightly. Thank you, dear. It means a lot. Marcus took the list, his heart swelling with pride. You're very welcome, Mrs. Jenkins. I'll have everything delivered to your door later today. She smiled again, then turned and slowly made her way out of the room. Marcus looked at Sarah, his smile widening. We got our first order. Sarah grinned, giving him a thumbs up. Told you it would work. The rest of the day was a blur. More people stopped by, placing orders, chatting with Marcus and Sarah, offering their support. It wasn't just about the deliveries. It was about building something that mattered, something that could bring the community together. By the time evening rolled around, Marcus was exhausted, but it was a good kind of exhaustion. He and Sarah sat in the storage room, the shelves now stocked with bags ready to be delivered. Marcus looked around, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. We did it, he said, his voice filled with awe. We actually did it. Sarah leaned back in her chair, smiling. Yeah, we did. And this is just the beginning, Marcus. There's so much more we can do. Marcus nodded, his eyes fixed on the shelves. He knew she was right. This was just the start of something bigger, something that could really make a difference. And for the first time in a long time, he felt hope. He wasn't alone. He had Sarah, he had his family, and now he had a community that believed in him. And he wasn't going to let them down. The following days were a whirlwind for Marcus. The delivery business was slowly but surely starting to pick up. Mrs. Jenkins wasn't the only one. People like Mrs. Alvarez, other shopkeepers, and even the elderly who couldn't leave their homes had begun to trust Marcus's community deliveries. He and Sarah worked tirelessly, running around the neighborhood, fulfilling orders and spreading the word. The community was responding, and Marcus could feel that this was going somewhere. But not everything was going smoothly. The old threats hadn't disappeared. They were just lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. It was late afternoon when Marcus was in the storage room, preparing the next delivery, when Kayla burst in, her face pale, her breathing ragged. Marcus straightened immediately, his heart dropping. Kayla, what's wrong? Marcus rushed to her, holding her shoulders. They were there. The guys from the bridge, she panted, eyes wide with panic. They were outside school, just watching me. They didn't come after me, but... Marcus felt a surge of anger and fear boil within him. The thought of these guys following his sister made his blood run cold. He clenched his jaw, his hands trembling as he held Kayla. Okay, he said, trying to keep his voice calm for her sake. Where are they now? Did they follow you? Kayla shook her head, tears starting to brim in her eyes. I don't think so. I ran to Sarah's first and she told me to come straight here. Marcus nodded, his mind racing. He had to put an end to this. He couldn't let them terrorize his sister like this. It had to stop, today. Sarah stepped in a moment later, her face tense. She walked over to Kayla, wrapping an arm around her. They won't stop, Marcus, she said quietly, her eyes meeting his. We have to do something. Marcus nodded, his face hardening. He had spent enough time waiting, hoping that George's intervention would be enough. Clearly, it hadn't scared them off. They thought they could come after his family, and Marcus wasn't going to let that slide. Stay here, Marcus said, his voice low. Both of you, I'm going to take care of this. Sarah's eyes widened and she grabbed his arm. Wait, Marcus, you can't just go after them alone. You don't even know where they are. Marcus clenched his jaw, his mind made up. I'll find them. I know where they hang out. This ends today. Sarah looked at him, her eyes pleading. Just be careful. Don't do anything stupid. Marcus gave her a small nod. I promise. Marcus left the storage room, his heart pounding as he made his way through the neighborhood. He knew where the guys usually were, an old, abandoned lot on the edge of the neighborhood. It was a place where trouble brewed, where people like them thought they were untouchable. Marcus had avoided that area for years, but today he was heading straight for it. The lot came into view, overgrown with weeds and littered with trash. Marcus could hear voices, laughing, talking, the casual sound of people who thought they were in control. He rounded the corner, and there they were, the three guys from the bridge, including Scar, lounging against the rusted frame of an old car. Scar looked up first, his face twisting into a smirk when he saw Marcus. "Well, well, look who decided to show up," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. The others turned, their expressions darkening. Marcus stepped forward, his fists clenching at his sides. "You need to leave my family alone. This ends now." Scar pushed off the car, his eyes narrowing as he sauntered over to Marcus. "Or what, hero? You gonna fight us all by yourself?" He laughed, shaking his head. "You don't know when to quit, do you?" Marcus's heart was pounding, but he didn't back down. He took another step forward, his eyes locked on Scar. "I'm done playing games. You show your face near my sister again, and I swear, you'll regret it." Scar's grin widened, his eyes flashing with amusement. "Oh, I'm so scared," he mocked, his voice taunting. "What's stopping us from taking care of you right here and now?" Marcus opened his mouth to reply, but before he could say anything, another voice cut through the air. "Me." Marcus turned, his eyes widening as he saw George stepping into the lot, two large men in suits following close behind. They looked completely out of place in the rundown lot, but the look on George's face made it clear that he meant business. Scar's smirk faltered, his eyes darting between George and Marcus. "What the hell is this?" he muttered. George stepped forward, his expression cold. "You were warned," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "You had your chance to walk away, but you chose not to. Now you'll face the consequences." The men in suits stepped forward, and Marcus could see the fear flash in Scar's eyes. He took a step back, his bravado crumbling. "Hey, we didn't mean anything by it," he said quickly, his voice trembling. "We were just messing around, that's all." George's expression didn't change. "Leave, now. And if I hear that you've come near Marcus or his family again, there won't be a next time." Scar swallowed hard, nodding quickly. Okay, we're gone." He turned, motioning for the others to follow him. They hurried away, their swagger gone, replaced by fear. Marcus watched them go, his heart still pounding. He turned to George, his eyes wide. You didn't have to do that," Marcus said quietly. George shook his head, his expression softening. "Yes, I did. You saved my life, Marcus. I'm not about to let these lowlifes hurt you or your family. Sometimes people like them need to be reminded of their place." Marcus swallowed, his throat tight. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what I would have done without your help." George smiled, resting a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "You don't have to thank me, Marcus. Just keep doing what you're doing. Take care of your family. Take care of this community. That's all the thanks I need." Marcus nodded, his chest swelling with gratitude. George gave him a final nod before turning and walking away, his men following close behind. Marcus watched them go, a sense of relief washing over him. It was over. The threat was gone. That evening, Marcus returned to the storage room, his body aching from the tension of the day. Sarah and Kayla were still there, their faces filled with worry when they saw him. "What happened?" Sarah asked, rushing over to him. Marcus gave her a tired smile. "It's over. George showed up. He took care of it. They're not going to bother us anymore." Kayla let out a shaky breath, her eyes filling with tears. She rushed to Marcus, wrapping her arms around him. He hugged her tightly, closing his eyes. "It's okay, Kay," he whispered. "It's over." Sarah watched them, her eyes softening. She stepped closer, her hand resting on Marcus's arm. "You did it," she said quietly. "You kept us safe." Marcus looked at her, his eyes meeting hers. He nodded, his heart swelling with a mixture of exhaustion and relief. Yeah, we're safe. Later that night, Marcus sat in the storage room, the space quiet and calm. He looked around at the shelves, the flyers, the supplies they had gathered. This was his place, his and his family's. And now, they had a chance to really make it work. He heard the door creak open and looked up to see Sarah stepping inside, her eyes meeting his. She walked over, sitting down beside him. You okay? She asked softly. Marcus nodded, letting out a long breath. Yeah, I think I'm finally okay. Sarah smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. Good. You deserve to be. Marcus looked down at her, his heart swelling with warmth. He wrapped an arm around her, pulling her closer. For the first time in what felt like forever, he felt at peace. The threat was gone, his family was safe, and he had something real, something he could be proud of. He wasn't alone. He had Sarah, Kayla, his mom, and now he had a community that believed in him. And he wasn't going to let them down. This was just the beginning. And for Marcus, that was more than enough. The next morning, the sun streamed through the curtains of Marcus's small apartment, bathing everything in a warm glow. The weight that had been pressing on Marcus's chest for weeks had lifted, and today felt different, lighter, easier. He rolled out of bed, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, and found Kayla already awake, sitting at the small kitchen table, her schoolbooks spread out in front of her. Morning, big brother, she said, giving him a smile. Morning, Kay, Marcus replied, walking over and ruffling her hair gently. You're up early. Yeah, I couldn't sleep much. I just wanted to get some homework done, she said, shrugging. There was a peacefulness in her eyes that Marcus hadn't seen in a while, and it made his heart swell with relief. The fear, the anxiety, it had loosened its grip on her. She seemed freer. That's my girl, Marcus said, smiling. He looked toward his mother's room, the door still closed. She was resting more now, her health showing small but steady signs of improvement. Marcus knew that with more care she'd get even better. The knock at the door startled them both. Kayla looked up, her eyes widening. Marcus walked over, peeking through the peephole. When he saw who it was, he opened the door with a smile. Hey, Sarah, he said, stepping back to let her in. Morning, Sarah said, stepping inside with a grin. She had 2 cups of coffee in her hands and a paper bag tucked under her arm. Figured you could use some breakfast. Always, Marcus said, taking one of the cups from her. You're the best, you know that? Yeah, don't get all mushy on me, Sarah replied, though her smile widened. She set the bag on the table, opening it to reveal a few pastries. Kayla's eyes lit up at the sight. Pastries? She said, her excitement barely contained. You're really spoiling us, Sarah. Sarah laughed, handing her one. Just trying to make sure my favorite family doesn't starve. Marcus watched them, his chest warming. It was moments like this, small, ordinary moments, that made everything worthwhile. They had all been through so much, but here they were, together, safe, and finally finding a bit of joy. After breakfast, Marcus walked with Sarah to the storage room. It was time to open up for the day. Business had started to pick up, and Marcus was determined to keep that momentum going. Today, they had a couple of new clients who had called in, and Marcus wanted to make sure everything ran smoothly. When they arrived, Marcus was surprised to see someone waiting outside the door. It was George, leaning against his cane, his face breaking into a warm smile when he saw Marcus. George, Marcus said, his eyebrows lifting in surprise. What are you doing here? George straightened, nodding to Marcus. I was in the neighborhood. Thought I'd stop by and see how my favorite entrepreneur is doing. Sarah gave Marcus a knowing look as she unlocked the door. I'll go get things set up, she said, stepping inside and leaving Marcus and George alone. Marcus turned to George, his expression softening. I don't know how to thank you, George, for everything you've done. George waved a hand dismissively. There's no need for thanks, Marcus. I meant what I said. You're doing something good here, something important. Marcus smiled, his heart swelling with gratitude. Still, you've given us a chance, and I won't forget that. George nodded, a glimmer of pride in his eyes. Good. I didn't expect you to. He looked past Marcus, at the small space that Marcus had turned into a business. You know, this is just the beginning, Marcus. If you play your cards right, you could make this into something much bigger. Marcus looked at the storage room, his mind racing with possibilities. He had been so focused on just getting things started, but now he realized that George was right. This was just the beginning. If he worked hard, if he stayed focused, there was no limit to where he could take this. I want to expand, Marcus said, his voice filled with determination. Not just deliveries. I want to help people here in the neighborhood. Maybe help with groceries, medicines, stuff that people can't easily get. I want to make this place better, George. George smiled, nodding. That's the spirit, Marcus. And remember, you're not alone. You've got people who believe in you, myself included. Marcus swallowed, his throat tight. Thank you, George. I won't let you down. I know you won't, George said, giving Marcus a reassuring pat on the shoulder. Now go on. You've got a business to run. The day moved quickly, filled with deliveries, new clients, and the comforting rhythm of work. Marcus found himself enjoying the busyness, the way each new order gave him purpose, the way people smiled when he brought them what they needed. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about helping people, about making life a little bit better for the people in his community. As the sun began to set, Marcus and Sarah sat on the steps outside the storage room, the day's work finally done. They were both tired, but it was a good kind of tired, the kind that came from doing something meaningful. Sarah leaned her head against Marcus's shoulder, her eyes closed. You know, I think this might actually work, she said, her voice soft. Marcus looked down at her, a smile tugging at his lips. Yeah, I think so too. They sat there in silence for a long moment, the world around them growing quieter as the evening settled in. Marcus felt a sense of peace that he hadn't felt in a long time. The threats were gone, the fear had subsided, and now there was only the future, bright, full of possibilities. Later that night, back in the apartment, Marcus sat with his mother and Kayla. The three of them gathered around the small kitchen table. Kayla was telling them about her day at school, her voice animated as she described a project she was working on. Their mother listened, her face filled with pride. Marcus watched them, his heart swelling. This was what he had been fighting for, this simple, quiet happiness. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't glamorous, but it was theirs, and that made it perfect. His mother looked at him, her eyes softening. You've done so much for us, Marcus, she said, her voice filled with emotion. You've given us a real chance. Marcus felt his throat tighten, and he reached across the table, taking her hand in his. I did it for us, Mom, for all of us, and I'm not stopping here. I'm going to keep building this, for you, for Kayla, for everyone. His mother smiled, her eyes misting over. I know you will, sweetheart. You've always been so strong. Your father would be so proud of you. Marcus swallowed, blinking back the tears that threatened to fall. I just want to make things better. For everyone. Kayla reached over, her hand resting on top of his. And you are, Marcus. You already have. Marcus looked at his sister, then at his mother, his heart swelling with love for both of them. He nodded, his voice thick. This is just the beginning. We're going to make it, together. The next morning, Marcus woke up early, a sense of excitement buzzing under his skin. Today was a new day, a day to keep building, to keep moving forward. He got dressed, slipping out of the apartment quietly, not wanting to wake his mother or Kayla. He made his way to the storage room, his office, his little business that was starting to grow. He unlocked the door, stepping inside, the smell of fresh paint still lingering in the air. He looked around, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was building something real, something meaningful. And he knew that no matter what came next, he would face it head on, with the people he loved by his side. Sarah arrived a few minutes later, her smile bright as she stepped inside. "Morning, boss," she said, handing him a cup of coffee. Marcus took it, his heart swelling. "Morning, partner," he replied, his voice filled with warmth. They had a long day ahead of them, deliveries to make, clients to meet, plans to put into action. But Marcus was ready for it. He was ready for all of it. He wasn't just fighting to survive anymore. He was building a life, one that he could be proud of, one that his family could be proud of. And for Marcus, that was more than enough. The future was bright, full of possibilities. And Marcus knew that whatever came next, he wasn't alone. He had his family, his community, and the people who believed in him. And with that, there was nothing he couldn't achieve.